Madam Speaker, the government has had some foreign policy accomplishments. It has continued Operation Reassurance in Eastern Europe and Operation Unifier in Ukraine, both military missions that we support. In trade, the new USMCA was concluded, a mostly defensive outcome that will see a drop of 0.4% in real GDP relative to NAFTA, as outlined by the C.D. Howe Institute. A trade agreement with the European Union was also concluded, but it must be said it was largely negotiated under the previous government. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, also largely negotiated under the previous government, was concluded, but it was almost upended by a Prime Minister who failed to show up at a meeting for 10 heads of government at the APEC summit in Vietnam in November of 2017. But whatever hope Canada had in starting trade talks with India was lost in the embarrassing antics of the Prime Minister during his 8-day trip to the world's 5th largest economy. And so too it was with trade talks with China, where he opened with a progressive proposal on the environment, labor, and gender rights, all non-starters for China. The deal was over before it had even begun. In general, the government's foreign policy has been a disappointment. The speech from the throne does nothing to change that. The government came to office with a big commitment to resurrect Canadian peacekeeping. Ils ont envoyé au Mali.
They sent hundreds of peacekeepers to Mali and hundreds of millions of dollars of Canadians. Like many things with this government, these efforts were deployed only for a short period of time, just 1 year. The government then lost the political will and interest in them, in the situation of this country.
Has ended. There's been a coup in Mali, and the government replaced by a military junta. The previous foreign minister mentioned the rise of populism and distrust of the global economy as one of the two big challenges in foreign policy. She pointed at her government's economic plan as a solution. After 5 years in power, we can judge. A Canadian economy that was in trouble before the pandemic had hit. Record high levels of household debt. The OECD and the IMF predict that we will have a deeper recession and a slower recovery than our economic peers. An economy with the highest unemployment in the G7 and a middle class that is further behind today than it was in 2015. Under this Prime Minister, Canada has become less prosperous, less united, and less respected on the world stage. The government came to office in 2015 telling the world that Canada is back, but the facts say otherwise. Canada lost its vote for the UN Security Council seat last June. It got 108 votes, 6 fewer than it got a decade ago. That's 6 fewer countries in the world today that see Canada as a leader on the global stage. That is a quantitative and identifiable indictment of this government's foreign policy. This government came to office saying it was going to make Canada a global leader in helping the poorest around the world. The opposite has happened. Under this government, official development assistance has declined. Under the previous Conservative government, ODA averaged 0.3% of GDP for the 10 years that government was in office. During this government, it has averaged 0.27%, a 10% decline. Bob Rae called out the government on its failure in foreign aid. In a damning indictment about Canada's ODA target number, he said, quote, "Canada has never come close to that number. And if our rate this year looks slightly better than last year's, it is only because the gross national income number is stagnant, not declining. Despite this record, Canadians think of their country as generous and deeply engaged on the international front." On climate change, this government has been a disappointment. They came to office promising to do better, but the facts say otherwise. In 2016, the first full year this government was in office, emissions were 708 megatons. In 2018, the last year for which we have data, emissions jumped to 729 megatons. Canada's emissions are increasing, and yet the government said in the speech from the throne that it will not only meet the Paris targets, it will exceed them. Yet again, another yawning gap between rhetoric and reality. This government's foreign policy has been incoherent and inconsistent. For example, China. China is not upholding its responsibility to the rules-based international system. It's ignoring its condition of entry into the WTO. It interferes through its state-owned enterprises. It infringes on intellectual property, and it engages in cyber warfare. It violates human rights and international treaties in its treatment of Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the Uyghurs, the people of Hong Kong. In short, it is threatening our interests and our values. In that context, it is really important that the government speak with a consistent, coherent voice. Unfortunately, that's not happening. In July, the foreign minister tells this House that he's looking at sanctions on Chinese officials. A day later, the government tells Reuters that's off the table. Just 2 weeks ago, the foreign minister tells the Globe that trade talks with China are off the table. The same day, Ambassador Barton says we should expand trade and do more in China. These are some of many, many examples. This government acknowledges its China policy is broken. That's why it's supposed to come forward this fall with a new framework. But I'm not confident it's going to address the problem, and here's why. Foreign policy starts with who we are. It's about our projection abroad of what we are all about. The problem is that this Prime Minister has said that Canada has no core identity, that we are just a collection of different groups, that we are the first post-national state. I could not disagree more. Canada isn't simply a collection of different groups with no common identity or common purpose. We as Canadians are some 37 million citizens who live on the north half of this vast continent, who share together a common identity and common purpose, a shared citizenship, rooted in our 2 official languages, our shared history, our collective institutions, and our future together. That's who we are as Canadians. The problem with this government's foreign policy is, if you don't know who you are, then your foreign policy will reflect that. Madam Speaker, let me finish by saying this. Foreign affairs matter. I know this firsthand. At the start of the Second World War, a young Chinese boy was defended by Canadian soldiers in Hong Kong. Half of them died or were wounded. At the end of that same war, a young Dutch girl was liberated by Canadian soldiers in the Netherlands. Some 7,500 of their comrades never came back home and died in the canals, the fields, and the villages of the Netherlands. That Dutch girl and that Chinese boy were my parents. They came to Canada in search of a better life. They believed in Canada. They believed in our nation's ability, generation after generation, to look beyond a person's color or their creed, to harness their ambition to build a better Canada. Mais c'est aussi celle des millions de Canadiens.
But it's also that of millions of Canadians who came here in recent decades or in the more distant past to make this country ours, to offer a better life to their children and to themselves, to build a better Canada.
Just 150 years ago, came together to build a new country. They built a constitution and a democratic system that endure to this day, a constitution that has enshrined timeless values and principles of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Ils ont fait du Canada une...
They made Canada a free, prosperous, and united country that has been able to overcome religious, linguistic, and ethical divisions.
Here and abroad, and this is the Canada the government must stand for here and abroad.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable
The honourable member for Lac Saint-Louis.
As always, I enjoyed listening to the member's speech, which is always very thoughtful. He mentioned he was rather, let's say he was negative on Canada's ability to meet its Paris targets, but I was wondering if he was aware of a report that came out of, I think it was Queen's University this week, that came out of its Institute for Financial Sustainability, that concluded that we can reach our targets with about 120 billion in investment, of which half could come from the private sector. And when I read that, it made me think of the throne speech, which mentions that the government will be creating a clean fund, a clean energy fund, and will be using the Canada Infrastructure Bank to leverage private capital towards achieving a greener future. So I think this report offers a lot of hope and a bit of a path forward, and I'd like to hear the members' comments vis-a-vis that report.
The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Well, I thank the member for his question. Climate change is one of our big foreign policy challenges, and I did read the report that came out of Queen's University. But I would say this, we are a long way from our Paris targets. Our target is 523 megatons, and we have a few 9 short years to reach that target. And on the path that we're currently on, with all the measures that have been implemented to date, all the analysis demonstrates that we are not on track to meeting those targets. And so I'm skeptical about the rhetoric in the speech from the throne that Canada will not only meet its Paris targets, but in fact exceed them. And so I'll await legislative and other measures that the government brings forward, but the track record doesn't suggest a lot of optimism.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague in his speech spoke about a number of international organizations, but unless I missed it, I didn't hear him talking about the WHO, the World Health Organization. We know that the United States have withdrawn from the WHO, and there was a request from the European Union for Canada to increase its participation to the WHO. I would like to know my colleague's and his party's position on the matter.
For Wellington Halton Hills.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We support the WHO. We think that it's an organization that is very important in a world in facing a huge pandemic. And we also support the role of Taiwan in this organization. I spoke with my counterpart in the Ottawa office for Taiwan and indicated that the Conservatives supported the inclusion of Taiwan in this organization because, in my opinion, Taiwan has done a good job of handling the pandemic.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate my honourable colleague on his appointment as Foreign Affairs critic. Unless I'm mistaken, I'm not sure I heard my colleague's views on Canada's relationship with Saudi Arabia. He mentioned some of the very serious transgressions of human rights in the world, and of course with Saudi Arabia we have an absolute monarchy. They are not only a democracy, but they actually don't even allow their citizens to vote. They're a known misogynist country. They are interfering in a neighboring country, Yemen, where we have maybe the largest humanitarian catastrophe on the planet, with children starving and civilians being bombed. We know that the Saudi Arabian government was responsible for murdering a journalist in Europe. I'm just wondering if he has any comment about what his party's position is on what Canada's relationship should be with Saudi Arabia, and does he agree with the NDP or me at this point that we should be putting sanctions on a country like Saudi Arabia that is violating human rights so egregiously?
The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for that comment. We believe that the government needs to uphold its obligations under domestic law, under the law concerning export and import permits regarding military exports and imports, and it needs to uphold its international obligations under the Arms Treaty. And we believe that the government has been inconsistent in upholding those obligations. The member mentions Saudi Arabia, but there is another present example this week of Turkey. A year ago, the government halted exports of military equipment to Turkey out of concern that they were failing to uphold their obligations as a NATO member. Last April, May, they reinstated the approvals for those permits, and exports have allegedly gone to Turkey, which are being used in Azerbaijan in the conflict that's currently unfolding in the Caucasus. And then this week, just several days ago, they reversed course yet again and put another halt to the export of permits. So it seems to me that the government is not upholding its obligations under domestic and international law.